Reconvene for our third panel today. We have from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, Matt DeMille, the Manager for Fish and Wildlife Services. Welcome to the table. And Brian McRae, Senior Advisor. And via video conference from the British Columbia Wildlife Federation, we have Chuck Zimmerman, Chairperson for Firearms and Recreational Sports Shooting Committee. And Mr. Zuckerman, we welcome you, but we understand you are only good until 2 because of video access. So just for senators' purposes, if you have questions, please lead with for Mr. Zuckerman if that's your interest. We have opening, who's doing opening comments? Mr. DeMille, would you please proceed?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, thank you for inviting us to talk about Bill C-71. The OFH is the largest conservation-based organization in Ontario, but we also represent all possible firearms interests, including hunting, trapping, and recreational shooting. Additionally, we represent 56 shooting clubs, which operate 80 CFO-approved licensed ranges. This is not just an Ontario perspective either. In fact, almost all of our affiliate fishing and hunting organizations from coast to coast to coast, including our co-panelist BCWF, have endorsed our submitted brief. In total, these organizations represent approximately 345,000 Canadians. Long-term trends show overall firearms-related crime is on the decline. But regardless of the statistics, no Canadian should deny there's a need to reduce gun violence. It's not about the if, it's about the how. We applaud the government's financial commitment to crime prevention projects across Canada, as well as funding for Rcmp and Canada Border Services Agency to ensure we have the resources needed for heightened security along our borders. This is the how we expect from government. The messaging and spending clearly indicate this public safety initiative was developed to target gangs, gang violence, organized crime, and illegal cross-border smuggling of firearms. However, this policy direction in Bill C-71 only targets law-abiding firearms users and does so in a way that will achieve negligible enhancements to public safety. The policy silence on gangs, violence, and serious firearms crimes is deafening. It's not surprising firearms owners feel unjustifiably targeted. This is the how that doesn't make sense to us, and so we cannot support the bill as written. There is a common misconception that there isn't enough scrutiny on who can obtain and keep a firearms license in Canada. Firearms owners are already one of the most vetted segments of Canada's population. New applicants undergo a rigorous screening process, and between 2012 and 2017, 4,637 license applications were refused. In addition, existing firearms owners undergo continuous eligibility screening to verify there has been no criminal activity since acquiring their license. Between 2012 and 2017, 14,505 licenses were revoked. Refusals and revocations occur for many reasons, including court-ordered prohibitions or probation, domestic violence, mental health, potential risk to self and others, and violent behavior. In 2017, there were just over 443,000 individuals prohibited from possessing firearms. The take-home, we have a screening system, and it works to enhance public safety. Is it perfect? No. But investing in a more coordinated and connected screening system among agencies has greater potential to enhance public safety than trying to dig deeper and look for different things. Today, in our opening remarks, we haven't been able to do a deep dive into the bill. I hope you've all had a chance to review our submitted brief that included a thorough analysis of each section of the bill with background context, outstanding questions and concerns, as well as results from a survey on Bill C-71 conducted by the OFH in April 2018 of more than 3,500 firearms users. Our opposition to Bill C-71 is not partisan, it is not emotional, it was not predetermined on principle. It was only after a thorough critical analysis that we arrived at the same conclusion for almost every proposal. It won't enhance public safety. The evidence simply doesn't support it. Licensed firearms owners care about public safety as much as other Canadians. The firearms community is not against firearms policy, but it needs to be evidence-based, and we want to see measures that will actually keep Canadians safe. One of the most significant challenges we face in establishing sound firearms policy is the politicization and therefore visceral polarization that almost always occurs. Unfortunately, the only conversations we seem to have about firearms occurs in the media, often after a tragic event, or in the political arena. There has been a lack of willingness on either side of the debate to get past the rhetoric and an entrenched view that we need to start in opposition to each other. In reality, we all want the same thing. We all want to reduce crime, violent crime, and the illegal use of firearms in Canada. If we stop fighting with each other, then we could turn that energy, time, and resourcing into achieving real public safety benefits for Canadians. To that end, the OFH has been invited to participate in a formal dialogue with a gun control advocacy group facilitated by the Mosaic Institute. The goal is to build mutual understanding, seek common ground, and attempt to develop public policy proposals to reduce gun violence that would be better informed and carry greater weight than either group could develop on its own. This dialogue will explore differences in perspectives between rural and urban Canadians, firearms users and non-users, and the lived experiences related to responsible firearms use and the misuse of firearms. There is a clear need for better education on both sides of this debate, and we believe this facilitated non-political discourse can build some momentum to help us get there. In the end, Bill C-71 has created confusion, concern, and eroded confidence in the government's approach to firearms policy. Even for the changes we can live with, there is almost no convincing evidence to demonstrate it will do anything to enhance public safety. If the government is serious about respecting the firearms community, then it can't move forward with Bill C-71 without significant amendments, not only to minimize the unnecessary scope of its impact on law-abiding Canadians, but also to introduce tangible provisions that directly tackle the stated intent of addressing gun violence. In conclusion, we are imploring this committee to ask tough questions and seriously consider meaningful amendments. Our recommendations for amendments include increased penalties for firearms-related violent crimes, requirements for accessible and effective appeal systems for individuals when licenses are refused, revoked, and when verification is not granted, the addition of specific provisions for retailer information security standards and penalties for noncompliance, rescinding the proposals to remove destinations for automatic ATTs, and the addition of a requirement for a standardized classification process that is consistent, transparent, evidence-based, fully consults firearms users, and includes an effective and timely appeal system for classification decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zuckerman, I understand you have some opening comments?
Yes, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting the 50,000 members of the BC Wildlife Federation to communicate with you regarding Bill C-71. Firearms ownership is a way of life for the responsible firearm owners of British Columbia. We appreciate the outdoors experience and are committed to placing natural, wholesome food on our families' dinner tables. We realize that this experience bonds us to our ancestors and the pioneer spirit. It forms the values that hold our families and society together. This is what gives meaning to our lives. Firearm uses is an important harvesting tool when it is based on the scientific management of species and fair chase ethics. The benefit of appropriate harvesting is it limits negative wildlife interactions, it prevents crop predation, it protects livestock, and it saves the government the cost of employing conservation officers to address problem wildlife. Safety. I am a licensed firearms instructor.
Mr. Zuckerman,
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you just to slow down slightly? They're having trouble with translation.
Okay, ma'am. The benefit of appropriate harvesting is it limits negative wildlife interactions. It prevents crop predation. It protects livestock, and it saves the government the cost of employing conservation officers to address problem wildlife. Safety. I am a licensed firearms instructor, a Master Corps hunting instructor, and a competition handgun shooter. A student may be issued a restricted firearms course report only after attending a 2-day training session and passing written and practical tests. Safety is a priority, and foremost in the instruction is always pointing the firearm in a safe direction and keeping your finger off the trigger. Learning the safe and legal use, storage, transportation, and display of non-restricted firearms requires that they be unloaded and have a trigger lock applied to them, or have them stored in a safe or securely locked container or room. Restricted firearms further require that they be unloaded with a trigger lock applied and transported in a locked case, with the ammunition transported in a separate locked case. Transporting restricted firearms in any other manner is an offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. It is illegal to carry a loaded or unloaded restricted firearm on your person. Only when the student successfully completes the course do they become eligible to submit an application. That application must then pass the scrutiny of an Rcmp background check. Bill C-71 proposed regulations create more onerous layers of regulation that only law-abiding firearms owners will follow. The proposed bill does nothing to address the issue of illegal firearms use or possession. What other recreational activity is so regulated requiring background checks every 5 years? Bill C-71 proposes to increase the firearm background check. This would rephrase the questions on Form 5592E, which all applicants must fill out. To answer these questions, it says you must provide details on a separate page if the answer is yes to any of the following questions. A, have you ever been subject to a peace bond or protection order? B, has any member of your household ever been prohibited from possessing any firearm? C, have you ever threatened or attempted suicide? Have you ever suffered, been diagnosed, or treated for depression, alcohol, drug, or substance abuse, behavioral problems, or emotional problems? D, have you ever experienced a divorce, a separation, or a breakdown of a significant relationship, job loss, or bankruptcy? When comparing licensed drivers to licensed firearm owners, ICBC stated that there were 642 motor vehicle accidents per 100,000 licensed drivers. The CBC in August stated that there were 0.6 firearm deaths per 100,000 across Canada, that there was 0.07 accidental shootings per 100,000 licensed firearms owners across Canada. Our question is, if licensed drivers are over 600 times more likely to have an accident, including fatalities, than licensed firearm owners, then why are they not required to undergo similar background checks? As alcohol and speed contribute to 51% of motor vehicle accidents, perhaps a renewable alcohol purchase license and speed governors should be required, as are seatbelts. In conclusion, would money not be better spent training and employing more law enforcement personnel? Would not a better solution be applying more resources to relieving the causes of crime, such as poverty, economic inequality, inadequate education, and drug addiction? To mitigate against criminal activity, would it not be better to discuss parenting schools and effective conflict resolution techniques as mandatory subjects in schools? Societal values can only be changed by education, not regulation. Respectfully, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerman. We'll now move to questions, starting with Senator Desjardins, to be followed by Senator Platt.
Alors, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Zuckerman, do you think that it's happened often that we've had to reclassify firearms?
There has been times when regular non-restricted firearms have been reclassified directly into prohibited firearms. The problem is, if you didn't have a prohibited firearms license, you're now in contravention of the criminal code, and you would have to then relinquish those firearms to the Rcmp. So that classification has happened. As to how often it's happened, that I do not know.
Maintenant,
Now, to your knowledge, reclassification of firearms, was it contested by citizens, and do you believe that a firearm owner will be satisfied with an appeal if there's a reclassification of a firearm? Because by reclassifying firearms, we're creating new prejudices with citizens, are we not?
Our Senator, thank you for the question. The issue really here is trust. The citizens trust the government to make the right decisions, and by this bill and the more restrictions applied to the citizens, does the government trust the citizens? By reclassification of these firearms, there is no appeal process at this time. The Governing Council has given the power of reclassification to the Rcmp. How do you appeal to the Rcmp? Who do you write to? Therefore, there isn't a appeal process right now in place that we can make facility of. you have to hire a lawyer and go to court or ask the lawyer to write on your behalf. That's expensive.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Zuckerman, I agree with your comment. If we would take all the cars off the streets, there would be no more car accidents and no more deaths by crazy automobile drivers. Couple of questions. It has been told to this committee that guns themselves are the alleged problem. This committee has heard from Professor Wendy Sukier, who has stated that, and I quote, "The number of restricted and prohibited firearms has increased from about 350,000 in 2004 to over 1 million, is a clear indication that we have a challenge, especially when you see some of the incidents involving legal firearms, as well as a diversion from legal to illegal markets." So any one of our witnesses, can you comment on this assertion? How easy is it to divert legal firearms to the illegal market in your experience?
Perhaps for ease of answer, Mr. Zuckerman, you want to go first, and then those present can answer.
Well, first off, it is illegal to take your restricted firearm and pass it on to anyone else, sell it at all, because you have to have the registration for that. It's registered in your name. The serial number is registered in your name, and you have a special number issued by the Rcmp as the registration number for that firearm. Whoever is purchasing that firearm, you must notify the Rcmp that they're getting it. They have to have a possession acquisition license for restricted firearms, and an authorization to transport has to be issued to them to take the firearm from either your residence or a gun show back to their residence. So at the point that you're giving a firearm, the legally purchased firearm, to someone who doesn't have the proper paperwork, you become a criminal. Therefore, it's not, you're passing from a criminal to a criminal.
Thank you, Mr. DeMille. Do you have any comment on that?
I think just to add to that, I think what's probably being referred to is things like theft and straw purchasing and some of those ways that domestic firearms may get into the illegal market. I think that one of the things that we've looked at a lot related to that is what we need is the system is there, but we need the system to be high functioning. And so we need ways of identifying where those illegal firearms are, where they're coming from, how they're getting there, and making sure that there's coordination among agencies. One of the biggest issues is you have so many different people involved in this. You have the Rcmp, Canadian Firearms Program. You have chief firearms officers. You also have police agencies. And so you have to make sure that everyone is talking to each other. Often the information is out there, but we need to make sure that everyone knows and has that best information.
Do you see anything in Bill C-71, Mr. Zuckerman, that would, or Mr. DeMille, that would take care of this?
Nothing is mentioned in the bill at all about this.
Thank you. Can you talk about how shooting, how the shooting sports and about the numbers of people now involved in shooting sports has changed in the past several years? And when I say talk about it very, very briefly, we're limited for time.
Yes, thank you, Senator. In the Lower Mainland, of which I'm the president in Vancouver, we've had doubling and tripling of the number of recreational shooters going to the clubs. Some clubs have 4,000, 5,000, and 6,000 members, and those increased numbers now have limited the ability to join those clubs because there are so many. Of all of those recreational shooting participants, there has not been one accident, one fatality anywhere in the Lower Mainland since the doubling and tripling of the numbers. Those people are well vetted. Those people have all the proper licenses, and the shooting sport itself is well regulated, whereby a referee stands next to you as you shoot and as you move from station to station, making sure that the firearm always is pointed downrange.
Am I done, or can I ask one more?
One more.
It's a bit of a comment, but then I want your response to it. Between 2014 and 2017, 66% of homicides by firearms were committed by people with criminal records. This tells us that at least 2/3 of gun homicides were the consequence of a failure to enforce our current gun laws because it is already illegal for someone with a criminal record to possess a firearm. More regulation would have done nothing to save these lives. And secondly, over the same period, 68% of all homicides were committed with a restricted or prohibited weapon. Since restricted and prohibited weapons are already registered and tightly controlled, it is clear, to me at least, that increasing gun control measures for non-restricted firearms will be equally ineffective in preventing gun crime. I would at least like a brief response from each of you on that. Mr. Zuckerman.
Yes, thank you for the question. Absolutely correct. Where are these people getting these firearms from is the first question to be asked, because they are not allowed to have possession acquisition licenses to begin with. The background vetting of someone, even today as it exists, can go back 20, 30, 40 years. And at that point, if they found a criminal record of a person, especially somebody who has had some type of an offense with a weapon of any kind, they should, in my opinion, be denied the ability to own a firearm. So I would question how they even got those firearms to begin with. If they got them illegally because they was purchased and the serial number is rubbed off, I'd be looking more towards gang activity. Remember, licensed firearms owners only had 0.6 per 100,000 deaths of licensed firearm owners. The people you're talking about were criminals to begin with. They never should have had firearms.
Thank you. Mr. DeMille, do you have anything to answer?
And I would just say briefly that, at the risk of repeating myself, is that we have a system, and the system can work, but we have to make sure that it is working as efficiently and effectively as possible. And the second part of that would be criminals don't care about additional regulations and rules, and that won't stop them from doing what they're going to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator McIntyre to be followed by Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your presentations. Last year, representatives of both your federations appeared before the House Committee on Public Safety and National Security on Bill C-71. A submission was made, accompanied by several recommendations. As we understand, you are both making the same recommendations today before this committee. We've heard from a lot of witnesses, and a lot of our questions have been answered. However, Mr. Zuckerman, in the submission submitted by your federation before the House Committee last year, it made reference to the fact that the UN firearms marking will be issued in a technical amendment, and my understanding is that your federation sees the UN marking requirement as an unnecessary and expensive duplication that should be dropped. So my question is this: does the amendment add value to the existing regulatory framework?
The answer would be no, Senator, and thank you for that question. What that marking was supposed to have been done in one phase is to be put numbers on the ammunition itself, not so much on the firearm. Therefore, somehow you could trace the empty shell casings, and how that would help in any way, shape, or form, and the onerous cost on the ammunition to the purchaser as well as to the manufacturers would, by defunct, absolutely bring in gun control to the point where no one could afford any type of firearms. The firearm markings that already exist on the firearms are serial numbers on every single firearm. How could that marking not be able to, that gets traced through the import duties and tariffs that are paid, traced through the dealers, the wholesalers, the retailers. Restricted, that's registered with the Rcmp right today. It's been registered there since prior to 1935. And the manufacturers manufacturers themselves, they have their master lists. So it was an unnecessary addition that would be cost prohibitive for firearm users in Canada.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Mr. DeMille, you wish to add?
I don't have anything significant to add. I think Mr. Zuckerman covered it. I think, just to repeat, I think the existing serial numbers that we have on firearms would suffice, and any additional markings are going to be cost prohibitive, and that's going to be passed down onto the consumer.
Senator Pratt to be followed by Senator Boisvenu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to our witnesses. Mr. DeMille, in the brief that you presented to the committee in the House of Commons, your federation said that it is not opposed to background checks that look further into the past. And the impression that I got from your testimony today is that you are opposed to such deeper background checks. So would you clarify your position for us, please?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that our comments today were mostly focused on, and you actually said this earlier in response to one of the other witnesses, is that we're not opposed to background checks that look back farther. What we're saying is they already do. And so that there's already background checks that aren't stopped at 5 years, and they can look for things beyond the criteria that people set or think within that 5 years. And so really what we're just trying to do is trying to get that information out there, better inform people that these won't really be enhanced background checks based on what the courts have already ruled, as you said earlier.
Thank you. You also said in the brief that you presented that the Federation is not opposed to mandatory retailer record keeping, which we discussed with earlier witnesses, but many firearms owners are concerned about the safekeeping and privacy of records, as well as how records will be accessed by police. And I'm just wondering whether the concern, certainly legitimate, but whether it's valid considering what's in the bill. What is required to be recorded by the retailer is the PAL number and the information on the firearm, but no personal information, no name, no address, so that even if someone hacked the computer system of a retailer, they will only get a list of PAL numbers with firearms, no address, no name. So are these concerns that your members have considering the privacy of these records, are these concerns, do you think, valid based on what is in the bill, or maybe on fears and distrust for the government?
I think it's less about distrust of the government in this case. I think it's more about lived experience in a retailer, in some cases where there might be a logbook or some sort of registry sheet that is just available on a counter where people may come upon that or see that or look at it from a distance now with cell phones, be able to take a picture. I think it was more about the idea, depending on the information that's kept, is that there needs to be some sort of standards to ensure that whatever information is collected, particularly if there's personal information, that there's going to be security around that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. You also commented in committee in the House of Commons about the statistics on crimes and suicides and so on. And you said that the government has overstated and misrepresented statistics to create a post-2013 Canadian firearms crisis, quote unquote. That simply isn't true. Yet, according to the latest data from Statistics Canada, in 2017, the firearm homicide rate reached its highest level in 25 years. So it's not a matter of only post-2013. It's the highest level in 25 years. So do you believe that that Statistics Canada is misrepresenting statistics? Sorry.
No, I think it was the way that it was communicated, and using 2013 as the benchmark was the concern, because it creates the absolute low point in the time series, and comparing to that, everything will be higher, and in some cases much higher. So as we said in our testimony, I think the statistics are not as important as what we're trying to achieve. And I think what we're trying to achieve is that whenever you have homicides, whenever you have suicides, whenever you have gun violence, domestic violence, those are all too high in Canada. And so I think the thing that we're trying to do in these conversations that doesn't happen enough is we need to talk about how do we tackle that? And I think the policies that we're talking about with this bill and with a lot of other firearms policy, unfortunately, it doesn't get there. We can't have those conversations because we talk more about the utility of those individual policies at such a specific level is that we're not looking at those root causes, and we're not looking at why is violence, it doesn't matter if it's gun violence or just violence in general, why is violence so high, and what can we do about that? Let's tackle that problem.
I certainly applaud your initiative of having a discussion, a dialogue with, I don't know what organization that will be, but it's certainly a great initiative. I think we do need to talk to each other to try to find solutions to these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Boisvenu.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to welcome our witnesses again. I have an issue with the government's position for this bill. First off, they would like to reduce criminality. And what we have noticed with statistics is cuts for the Rcmp. In 2018, it was quite difficult. Same in 2019. There were cuts for the Rcmp. And at the same time, what we've noticed in the Yukon is that there are around 2,092 files that are still waiting for a response by the Rcmp that have to do with mental health issues and other issues. And there's around 3,000 files in Alberta and in the Northwest Territories. We want certain things, but we're also giving cuts to the Rcmp, who has to manage different things and deal with people with mental health issues. I have an issue with the government's position. I don't know what yours is. Because if you look at the firearms owners who have to be inspected by the Rcmp, well, you must have seen it with your members who have seen delays. What is your position on this government's position that seems to be quite contradictory?
Would you like me to respond?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. You're from BC,
Okay.
so maybe you'll be aware.
Right. Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. That is really an acute, intelligent observation to be had. I've had to go 4 5-year background checks since 1995, 97, when the bill originally came out. If I've passed 4 or 5-year background checks, why are you asking me, I'm 69 years old, why are you asking me to go back to when I was 18 years old, I suspect, and remember all the relationships I have been in, all the jobs that I have had, write down all this information. Some person that I was living with when I was 50 years ago, I'm supposed to remember their names, addresses, phone numbers. Fine. But how are you going to put somebody to check those references? How much money is it going to cost? You're going to spend an entire day on me alone checking all my backgrounds. Is that an efficient use of the money? And I really appreciate the question, because money could be spent so much more efficiently. If there's red flags that come up from other background checks in the past, or if there had been some type of court orders that were done, that should show up on the computer system. Further, the different police organizations do not speak to the Rcmp. Here in British Columbia, we have the Vancouver Police, the North Vancouver Police, the New Westminster Police, the Abbotsford Police. All these police have separate files, and it's only a phone call that connects them to the central database that's maintained by the CPIC computers in the Rcmp. That needs to be better coordinated. It's not a matter of wasting money, in our opinion, of going through background checks and reclassification of firearms that's not proven to be crime-fighting techniques. That's what we need. It's the people that are using guns for criminal purposes, and you need to have boots on the ground to be able to do that, not people sitting in an office on the telephone, checking pieces of paper and typing things into a computer.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. Thank you for the question. I think that this is something that we've been very interested in. I think even though we've talked about some of the policies being rather benign in their ability to enhance public safety, not many of these policies are benign in what they will do and require from a capacity perspective. So they're really going to need to have good systems to ensure that there's not those delays, because those delays are being experienced now. And so investment in that capacity is required. And so I think whenever there is policy changes like this, particularly where there's a system, we need to have the capacity. And most of what we've heard from members is they're very concerned about the delays that could occur.
Senators, if there are no more questions? Oh, you're good? Okay. Mr. DeMille, Mr. McCray, Mr. Zuckerman, we want to thank you very much for participating today. It's been very informative. And senators, we will suspend until 2:45.